Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Democracy Days 2020, the pandemic edition. My name is Michael Kelker. I teach English at St. Charles Community College, and I am the organizer of Democracy Days from 2001 to present. And it is my pleasure to introduce from the Department of History, Steve Randoll, who will enlighten us about the pandemic from 1 century ago. I'd like to call your attention to the program booklet at the top of the web page and also to the chat box where I will be collating questions. And as soon as Steve gives me the signal, I will feed him questions that are coming from you, the audience. So please have those gears functioning as you listen to Steve, and we'll continue the discussion at that time. Steve, thank you for being here. Take it away,
Oh,
sir.
thank you for having me. All right. Well, my talk is on one of the fascinating confrontations in history that is actually very little known, but deserves to be better known. And it turns out to be very topical as well. In 1918, in October, when the second wave of the very serious 1918 pandemic, influenza pandemic, struck St. Louis, the mayor and the health commissioner got together and imposed strict social distancing regulations on business and on social gatherings. And this turned out to be quite controversial. There was a lot of pressure that was put on the mayor. People thought this was too harsh. They thought it was going on too long. They thought it wasn't necessary. And the mayor went to Dr. Starkloff, the health commissioner, and said, I hear from very good authority, you're doing too much. This is not necessary. And I want you to ease up on these restrictions. And Dr. Starkloff stood his ground and he told the mayor, and I quote, "You can't do it and I won't." And consequently, in 1918, St. Louis did very well in the 1918 influenza pandemic. St. Louis did not suffer nearly as badly as a great many other cities did. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that this isn't a dichotomy of politics bad, public health good, because Dr. Starkloff has to take into consideration the economic and the social consequences of the measures that he is undertaking. And if you are too harsh, if you are too extensive, if it is going on too long and people aren't cooperating, it undermines public health efforts to control an epidemic. And so Starkloff compromised and he eased up on, and he eased up on the restrictions, and then the influenza epidemic ticked up later on in November and December. And as soon as it did so, Dr. Starkloff reimposed conditions and slowed down the mortality rate and the infection rate from the disease again. And then in December, he eased up again. And consequently, people learned a great deal about how to control these pandemics when you do not have a vaccine for a particular disease. So this is the story of the 1918 influenza pandemic in St. Louis. We start with, first of all, influenza itself, because influenza has been around for a very, very long time. And it's not generally fatal, and it normally is only fatal for very young children whose immune systems are not developed, or for elderly individuals whose individual system has been compromised. Okay. there's about 20% of the population that comes down with the flu every year in the United States. About 114,000 those are hospitalized. About 36,000 deaths occur from influenza every year. And so health officials do take influenza very seriously. But 1918 was different. This particular flu triggered what is called a cytokine response in the immune system, which flooded the lungs with fluid. And consequently, the people who were most at risk were the people who had the strongest immune systems, and that's people in their 1920s and 1930s. We've not seen this kind of pattern before in influenza, and we've not seen this pattern since. Right? So originally, in August of 1918, a wave of influenza began, similar to what had struck Europe in the beginning of the year. And so soldiers at Camp Devers in Massachusetts began coming down with the flu. And you have very healthy young men, very fit young men dying of influenza. And so President called on Dr. William Welch, the most preeminent pathologist in the United States, to go up to Massachusetts and find out what was going on. And when Welch did his autopsy on one of these young men and saw what had happened to this young man's lungs, he was shocked. And when he was shocked, that panicked everybody else. So the younger doctors thought, oh my God, we've never seen anything like this. We'll call on Dr. Welch. He's the leading expert in the country, and he'll know what to do. And when Dr. Welch was momentarily shocked, people thought, oh my God, now we are really in trouble. Right? And so people began to consider, what are we going to do to contain this influenza outbreak? Now, at the time, people thought influenza was caused by a bacterium, a bacillus known as Pfeiffer's bacillus. And so when you got influenza, they told you, get some bed rest, get some fresh air, get plenty of food, take some pain medication, and you'll be okay. That's not the way this influenza operated. And so as the death toll began to rise elsewhere in the United States and the East, and it started to spread west, Dr. Starkloff, who's the health commissioner of St. Louis, he prepared an ordinance specifying that influenza would be treated as a contagious disease. That would require local physicians to report cases of influenza to the health department, and it gave authority to Dr. Starkloff to try to contain the situation. The mayor agreed and goes to the Board of Aldermen, presents this ordinance, and then when 7 people in a family near a school came down with influenza, the Board of Aldermen went ahead and passed the measure. This isn't something that Starkloff is doing on his own. He doesn't have the authority as health commissioner to just step in and say, okay, do this, do that, and it gets done. He's got to cooperate with the mayor. He's got to cooperate with the Board of Aldermen. He's got a Board of Health that he deals with. So it's not like Starkloff is doing this all on his own. The mayor has the power to declare an epidemic. And so the mayor goes ahead and declares an epidemic. And that gives the health commissioner the power, if he thinks it's necessary, to impose social distancing. Right? The Red Cross began making gauze masks for people in St. Louis, for the military, for its own workers. And Mrs. Frank Hammer, who's the chairperson of the St. Louis chapter of the Red Cross, she told the Post-Dispatch, okay, if you ask us to do this, we will make masks for St. Louis. And Dr. Starkloff really wasn't concerned about masks. Masks were controversial in 1918. a lot of people felt that masks would be ineffective against the spread of a respiratory disease, which is interesting. Starkloff had something else in mind. He thought that influenza would reach epidemic proportions in St. Louis, and so he would impose social distancing measures instead. So the mayor went ahead and issued a proclamation giving the health commissioner the authority to do what is necessary. And October the 6th, Dr. Starkloff issued his first directive. Now remember, they only had a case of influenza in St. Louis in September 28th to be precise. So St. Louis is reacting very, very quickly to the influenza epidemic. Starkloff went ahead and issued a directive closing theaters, closing moving picture shows, schools, Sunday schools, billiard halls, cabarets, lodges, societies, public funerals, open air meetings, dance halls, conventions, and even library reading rooms. In particular, Starkloff closed the schools. Now, he did not know at the time, but we know today that children are incubators of influenza. And this is something that we have learned because a number of cities like Chicago, for example, did not close the schools, and they did worse than St. Louis did. So one of the things that we have learned, why do you think we're doing this right now on Zoom instead of at St. Charles Community College, is close the schools, break the chain of transmission. He did not close churches, but he did ask for voluntary cooperation, and he got it from the churches initially. And he did suggest that he would close the churches later. Now, again, Starkloff doesn't have absolute authority to just issue orders willy-nilly. Washington University, for example, is not under the jurisdiction of the health department of St. Louis. But the chancellor of Washington University is cooperative, went ahead, and he voluntarily closed the school early. Now, Starkloff told everybody, he said, please suspend any unnecessary gatherings. Any kind of crowding is going to potentially spread the disease. And he told everyone, don't bother asking permission from the health department to meet because the answer is going to be no. Okay? He also suggested, since factories and merchant stores were still open, have a physician on hand just in case you have a worker or you have a customer who exhibits signs of being sick. Once Dr. Starkloff issued this order to close down all these places, he walks into his office the next day and there are people crammed into his waiting room protesting the order. Right? The Motion Picture League said, you're closing the theaters, but you're not closing the department stores. We're being singled out here. This is not fair. And there's no epidemic here. There's no likelihood of there being one. Why are we being shut down here? And people asked for exemptions. So all these exemptions are flowing in, and the health department turned down every single request for an exemption. The order is going to be effective only if it's completely obeyed. And Dr. Starkloff is not going to make any concessions here. In fact, on October 9th, he extended the ban to include weddings and social gatherings. And the police received orders to disperse any gatherings in public of 6 or more people. This included breaking up gatherings of 6 or more people in bars. And you can imagine that caused a little bit of trouble between the bar patrons and the police. But the police chief did give instructions to police not to make any kind of trivial arrests, keep the court dockets as clear as we possibly can. It is at this point that our confrontation occurred. Now the mayor goes to Dr. Starkloff and says he's got responsible people telling him the restrictions are not necessary. You need to lighten up. The mayor felt, I've been really cooperative with you, but I'm getting a lot of heat from the business community, and we think the mayor and the business community think that the ban is too restrictive. That's when Dr. Starkloff laid down his statement, "You can't do it, and I won't." The ban stayed in place. And in fact, when the Board of Aldermen met, they gave Starkloff more authority. The Board of Aldermen met and declared influenza a contagious disease and gave the health department the authority to quarantine private homes. The mayor, on the other hand, did an interview with the Post-Dispatch on the 14th of October saying, we might modify this ban or we might lift it altogether. Dr. Starkloff is saying at the same time in the Missouri Republican, there's going to be no relaxation of this general order. Now, Mayor Keel did win consent from the health commissioner to hold the Liberty Loan Parade. Remember, this is 1918. There's a little thing going on called World War I, which is rather important. We're getting close to victory here. And so we need to keep the pressure on Germany. And so we have Liberty Loan Parades to raise money for the war effort. And so we're going to have a Liberty Loan Parade. Okay, we will do this. This isn't a threat. People only gathered momentarily, according to the mayor, and the health commissioner said, okay, go ahead, you can have your parade. So if you're going to allow the parade, if you're going to allow a large crowd like that, lots of business people are saying, okay, why are we doing this? Why are we having this extensive ban? And Dr. Starkloff pointed out, if you look at Chicago, Chicago is suffering greatly. They did not impose a closing order very soon, and consequently, Chicago was doing much worse in the epidemic than St. Louis was, and therefore, we're not going to ease up on the ban. He did, however, lift the ban on restaurants and barber shops. So he did give in a little bit to the pressure. He also had an interesting comment from the WCTU. The Women's Christian Temperance Union protested, okay, you're closing the schools, you're closing the theaters, you asked the churches to close, and you're allowing the bars to remain open. The temperance people didn't particularly like that one. Okay? Now, the health commissioner, while he refused to lift or modify the ban on the theaters and the motion picture houses, he did promise to meet with city officials and health officials who advised the health department, but he said, I don't think the order should be lifted. The commissioner is not oblivious to business concerns, but he did need a good medical reason before he modified or ended his order. When he did impose restrictions on the stores, he then turned around a week later and lifted the restrictions on the downtown retail stores. Those stores didn't have the big crowds. And so he felt, okay, that's reasonable. Okay? On October 30th, Starkloff is again asked, call a meeting of the advisory committee of the health department and consider lifting the closing order. The city situation is improving. The ban is working. The death totals are going down. The illnesses are going down. Let's go ahead and see if the larger advisory committee will approve lifting the closing order. Dr. Starkloff, again, is resisting. All these people around the country are citing St. Louis as a big success. And we're saving all these lives. So let's not lift the ban. So he asked the mayor, should I call the committee for the vote? The mayor said, no, I got one vote on the committee in favor. That's not going to be enough. So the ban stays in place. When the committee did meet, the mayor said, let's end the closing order, even if we just listen for a few days. The mayor admitted he did so because business leaders were pushing him to do this. Dr. Starkloff said, on medical grounds, don't do this. Less than 1% of St. Louis population has come down with noticeable symptoms of influenza. thanks to the closing order. Chicago's doing worse than we are. Let's not lift the closing order. And so the committee instead voted to extend the ban, and any mercantile establishments, any non-essential business activity were to close. Business community didn't like this. They protested. Having business stopped is an experiment in public health, and they suggested closing only unsanitary businesses. Dr. Starkloff argued this is not an experiment. This is working. St. Louis really is doing better than other cities. When the department decided we will close strictly unsanitary businesses, well, the businesses that were told they were unsanitary told us to go to the devil. And so that wasn't going to work. Now, in fairness, the business community, the new order did sometimes appear arbitrary. A saloon owner, for example, refused to close. He ran a combined restaurant and bar. So, therefore, if he can keep his bar open, why can't he keep his restaurant open? I'm sorry, he was supposed to close his bar, but to keep his restaurant open. I'm sorry, I got that backwards. Okay. So the assistant health commissioner steps in. Starkloff had gotten sick and had stepped down temporarily. And so the assistant health commissioner ruled, tell this guy he can serve food, but he can't serve anything to drink. Now, that doesn't seem to have any kind of medical justification. And that doesn't help. Having these kinds of arbitrary criticisms and arbitrary shutdowns doesn't help win business support for the closing order. Right? On November 12th, Starkloff gave in to the pressure and announced that, yes, we're doing well, therefore the closing order is going to be lifted. And at midnight on November 12th, the 4-day extensive ban lifted. The advisory committee also lifted the ban on stores, on factories, on shows, etc. Now, the department's own records show that influenza cases were still rising. And on November 26th, the number of new cases took off again. Dr. Starkloff says at this point, no, I'm not concerned about this. 2 days after he announced that he was not concerned, he closed down the St. Louis schools again and put restrictions on the size of gathering. So he may be saying publicly for public consumption, okay, I'm not really worried about this, but he's acting as if, yes, I'm worried about this. Cases start to go up, we have to cut it down again. Dr. Starkloff stated, our city is again confronted with an outbreak of influenza, but the problem with that statement is the influenza hadn't actually gone away in the first place. He's still dealing with the same wave. Now, they weren't going to have a general closing order because that was going to be really tough on business. On the other hand, the director of public welfare stated publicly, look, guys, it's a mistake to lift this ban. You have given in to public pressure, you've lifted the ban, and now the cases in influenza have gone up. This is a mistake. Okay? Well, now the influenza epidemic is going to officially come to an end in December. In December, you still have influenza cases. The weekly bulletins of the health department show the epidemic is still severe, even as the newspapers are reporting, yeah, the situation is getting better. And the health department went ahead and ended most of their restrictions on December 20th. And the epidemic officially came to an end in St. Louis on December 28th, when the health department ended any and all restrictions on activities due to influenza. Now, the difficulty here is that the second wave of influenza didn't end in December. Influenza tends to get worse in the wintertime. December is right in the middle of the winter. This is flu season, right? And it's not until April of 1919 where the influenza really went away. It's not until the week that ends in May 17th of 1919 that the health department reported no deaths from influenza in the city. Now, the difficulty, though, is if you're dealing with influenza, you can't shut down the city for 6 months at a time. Economically, this is not feasible. This is not an option, particularly for small businesses that can't go half the year without any income at all. Then, of course, one of the overlooked points about the influenza epidemic of 1918 is that it's not the influenza epidemic of 1918. It goes into 1919, and then there's a third wave in 1920. And in January and February of 1920, in fact, we had a higher death rate in St. Louis than we did in October of 1918. Okay? So what do we conclude from all of this? Okay, well, anytime there's a ban on economic activity in the name of public health officials can expect that there's going to be pressure from business interests to lift the ban. That happened in 1918. That's happening now in 2020. The consequences of surrendering to that kind of pressure can, however, be very severe, as the influenza epidemic, or coronavirus in this case, can resume, can worsen. Right? Now, in Dr. Starkloff's case, remember, he is only one official, and he is not the dictator of public health who can impose these restrictions. He's got to have the mayor, he's got to have the business community, he's got to have public opinion, he's got to have other medical authorities behind him to make this thing work. And if he doesn't, then he's probably not going to be health commissioner very much longer. And so in St. Louis, Dr. Starkloff knuckled under in December in order to survive politically. Now, one of the things I found in my research when I was researching a paper on St. Louis, which this little talk is based on, in 1930, the Post-Dispatch ran an article about Dr. Starkloff, who's now retiring as health commissioner, and oh, what a wonderful guy he is, and how great he did back in October of 1918, which the paper forgot they had criticized him for doing at the time when the epidemic was raging. And so now, in a sense, the Post-Dispatch is finally admitting, okay, Dr. Starkloff, you were right, I was wrong. Okay? And Dr. Starkloff kept that in his scrapbook. His scrapbook, by the way, is available at the Thomas Jefferson Library's archive at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. Okay? So when we look at the influenza epidemic of St. Louis, this is Dr. Starkloff, by the way. This is the guy who gets most of the credit for why St. Louis did so well during the 1918 epidemic. And here's a chart to give you an idea of how this works. Here's a chart. You will notice over here, this big spike, that's Philadelphia. All right, Philadelphia put in restrictions very late and did not put in very restrictive measures to contain influenza, and they got hammered. This line, on the other hand, is St. Louis, and you notice as 1918 goes along, then it picks up. This is when Starkloff lifted his restrictions, and then he clamped back down, and then the number of influenza cases starts to tail back down again. So when public health officials argue today that social distancing works, There it is. There's the chart. This is filled out. This is no social distancing. This is social distancing. That's why they believe that. Okay? Because there's good, solid historical information that social distancing works as a means of controlling influenza epidemics. All right? Now, where do we get masks from? Well, Starkloff didn't order masks to be used in the influenza epidemic in 1918 in St. Louis, but San Francisco did. San Francisco used masks, San Diego used masks, and along with social distancing measures, San Diego and St. Louis and San Francisco all did very well in the influenza epidemic of 1918. That's where we get the evidence for masks. A lot of cities, on the other hand, didn't use masks. And a lot of people argued, and John Barry in his book, The Great Influenza, here he is, the leading historian of the influenza epidemic, he argued that it's probably the social distancing and not the masks that helped San Francisco. Well, the difficulty is this is not a controlled scientific study. This is historical evidence only. And you don't have controlled scientific studies about the efficacy of masks in 1918, or even when John wrote his book, The Great Influenza, a number of years ago. Nowadays, of course, we can do more controlled studies and we can see how much a mask prevents people from spreading their own germs. It's not so much that a mask is going to help you, but it is going to help protect other people if you don't have any symptoms and you still have influenza or coronavirus or whatever infectious disease. That's where the masking comes in. And there are studies, and of course, there's the example of San Diego and San Francisco that reinforce the idea of using masks. But masks by themselves are not sufficient. Right? It also has to be accompanied by social distancing measures. Chicago appeared to do pretty well. When you look at the final figures, Chicago didn't do that much worse than St. Louis. Where is Starkloff getting his information that St. Louis is doing so much better than Chicago in 1918? In fact, the health commissioner of Chicago, John Dale Robertson, published an article, and he claimed, Dr. Robertson claimed, that Chicago's numbers are just a tiny bit worse than St. Louis's numbers. And since Chicago's population is so much higher, that Chicago was actually the healthiest city in the Midwest. And people in St. Louis were horrified and wrote a counter article arguing that St. Louis's numbers were better. And what Dr. Robertson had done is he looked at influenza, but he didn't look at pneumonia. Whereas in St. Louis, we looked at the excess deaths from influenza and from pneumonia. Because how does the influenza epidemic of 1918 kill people? It does so by stimulating your immune system to overreact and flood the lungs with fluid. And when your lungs are flooded with fluid in 1918, they call that a death by pneumonia. They don't call that a death by influenza. And so if you look at the 8,500 deaths in Chicago by influenza, and you skip the extra 8,000, 9,000 deaths from pneumonia, then Chicago's numbers look pretty good on a per capita basis. If you add in those pneumonia numbers, it doesn't look quite so good. Right? Another point that I would like to make as well is that finally, when we look at the influenza epidemic, this is an H1N1 virus. And consequently, most of the flu epidemics that we've had since the 1957 pandemic, the 1976 swine flu scare, the H1N1 outbreak that occurred recently under the Obama administration, those are all spin-offs. Those are all mutations of the 1918 H1N1 virus that struck so hard at that time. The H3, there's an H5 outbreak. Yeah, there's an H3 outbreak and there's an H5 outbreak that occurred of influenza. Those are not related to the influenza pandemic of 1918. But most of the influenza epidemics that we have seen have been related to this particular virus, which is why when we're threatened with an influenza pandemic, then suddenly everybody rolls out all the heavy measures to make sure that influenza doesn't go viral, to coin a phrase, because we don't want a replay of the 1918 epidemic. It is estimated that somewhere between 50 million and 100 million people died during the 1918 influenza pandemic. That's just the second wave, folks, okay? That doesn't count the first wave in April. That doesn't count 1919, 1920 excess deaths from influenza. And I'm of the opinion, having studied this in various cities, that the overall global death rate is closer to 100 million than it is to 50 million. This is why we take this stuff seriously. This is why we take something like the coronavirus seriously. We've learned from the history, social distancing does work. Masks do contribute to controlling an epidemic and breaking the spread of transmission. And that's why we have those measures in place today. We also know from the history that there's going to be opposition from the business community, that you can't simply shut down an economy for 6 months at a time. So you have to act early. St. Louis acted early. Philadelphia did not. And there's the result. If you act early, you can have these measures in place for a short period of time, keep the infection down, keep it from spreading and taking off. If you don't act early, if you let the influenza virus in and you let it take hold in the population, that's when you have a serious problem. Okay? So those are the kinds of lessons we have learned from the 1918 pandemic. And these are the kinds of things that people cite today when looking at how to control an epidemic when you don't have a vaccine for it. Okay, so probably ran a little bit longer than I planned on, but if you guys have any questions, I will be happy to take questions now from Michael.
Yes, we do. Thank you, Steve. That
I bet we do.
Yes, very, very good. I appreciate that. And it's always good when we can add to our historical perspective on any subject. Now, one of the questions
you also have to remember there's a limitation to what we know historically, because it's not a controlled scientific study. And so we're lucky sometimes when it's unfortunate for the people at the time, but when everybody does something different, here Philadelphia doesn't do anything. Chicago does something but doesn't close the schools. St. Louis closes the school. So you have information where you're doing an unintentional controlled experiment that gives us the ability to compare across cities what's working better and what's working not as well. Okay, go ahead, questions.
Yeah, this question was actually first, so it was much earlier in the hour, but
sure.
Maybe you could just summarize with some bullet points the strongest parallels for understanding parallels to the 1918 pandemic. What would be the crucial learning points or themes, if we want to look for parallels, if we want to look for how history can guide us. I think some of that was dropped along the course of your presentation, but just
sure. Number one, early intervention. You don't want a pandemic to get loose in the community and then try to contain it. You want to prevent it from getting loose in the first place, okay? Number two, close the schools. Children are a reservoir for these kinds of diseases. And so even if the children are not suffering very severely themselves, they're going to catch the disease, they're going to spread it to other people, and they're going to spread it to people who very well may die from the disease. So closing the schools is very, very important. One of the biggest differences between St. Louis and Chicago is Chicago did not close their public school system and St. Louis did. Okay? And St. Louis consequently fared much, much better. Okay. Number three, okay, social distancing works. And so it's important to have social distancing measures. It's important to have masks. Number four, you got to have public support. You can't just dictate to the business community. You can't just dictate to the churches. You can't just dictate to ordinary people. You've got to explain to them. You've got to win public support. You got to say, look, we are not going to put you out of business in the name of controlling a pandemic. We are going to help you. We're going to put these restrictions in for a short period of time early, and then we can go ahead and lift them. We can have an economy and we can have a healthy community at the same time.
Thank you. There was a question that came in about the ending of restrictions in December of, would that have been 1918?
December of 1918. December of 1918, right.
Why? Why did they end the restrictions?
There is pressure from the business community, from the churches, from the general public. A lot of people are complaining. You've had these restrictions in place in October and then on into November. And people are saying, okay, this is too much. St. Louis is doing really well. They're reading in the newspapers, there's not that many cases of influenza. There's not that many deaths. Why are we strangling the St. Louis society? Why are we strangling the St. Louis business community? And so Dr. Starkloff, as I point out, he's not a dictator. He can't simply say, look, we're going to impose these restrictions and I'm the only one who's in charge here. Starkloff could be fired as health commissioner. And so he's got to work with the community. He's got to have public support. And so he has to politically ease up on the restrictions if he is going to maintain some support for restrictions on influenza. And then when it starts to tick up again, you notice what happened in the chart with St. Louis. The influenza epidemic is under control. You ease up on those restrictions and the numbers start to get up, and you don't want those numbers to shoot way up. So he reimposes controls. And then when you start bending the curve back down again, then you ease up on the restrictions again. If you bend the curve, then you can do something about those restrictions. Okay?
Thank you. Sources of information, because information gets politicized, as we all know so well. What are the best sources for finding out information? Because we've got some questions and comments, and from this, there's a dovetailing into another question about the role of conspiracy theory. But just first of all, for good, solid information.
For good, solid information, what you do is you go, first of all, to, if you're a professional historian, and you can do this as an amateur as well, You can go to the archives and you look at the weekly health bulletins. You can look at the Department of Health reports. You can look at the count that they have of influenza deaths, pneumonia deaths, that sort of thing. You can go to the CDC website and they give you good information. You can go to the World Health Organization website. They give you good information. You can go to various university or public health institution websites. You can go to, for example, Johns Hopkins University. You can go to Washington University School of Medicine. You can go to Harvard University Medical School of Medicine, and you can get good information there about any pandemic or any death toll, et cetera. Okay. Now, the difficulty is, all right, they're only as good as the information that is being reported to them. All right. And so when you get a death rate from influenza, as what happened in Chicago, okay, Chicago says, well, you look at our death rate. St. Louis has 363 deaths per 100,000 people. Chicago has 373 deaths per 100,000, according to their own public health report. And when you look, they're only counting influenza deaths. And that's a little fishy because they're not counting the deaths from pneumonia. And you look at Chicago and you say, well, the pneumonia deaths are way up. You might average 2,000 deaths a year in Chicago for pneumonia. I forget the exact number. I'd have to pull my book off the shelf and look it up. But it's about that. Suddenly you've got 9,000 deaths from pneumonia in 1918. It just went up 350%. Why? Well, it's influenza. Those are influenza deaths that are triggering the pneumonia. Okay. So when you look at the official figures tend to be undercounted because not everything gets reported, or sometimes deaths get misreported, they get miscategorized, they fall under another category. Okay. So now, as you know, I'm not a real big fan of conspiracy theories. All right. And the problem with conspiracy theories is they tend to look at information and say, okay, I don't really want to believe this information, therefore it's a conspiracy. And if they have evidence for it, okay, maybe, conspiracies do exist, all right? There's a conspiracy to assassinate Abraham Lincoln, for example. We know that happened. We know many of the people who were involved in that. But there's evidence for this, okay? So unless you have evidence that people are tampering with the reported deaths, as opposed to making honest mistakes, people make mistakes all the time. When Dr. Robertson is out there saying, okay, here's my influenza deaths, he's right, here's my influenza deaths, all right? He's being honest, all right? He's making the mistake, though, of not counting the pneumonia deaths, all right? He's not trying to fake anything. He's making an honest mistake, all right? Whereas if you say, oh, well, that's part of a conspiracy, why would Robertson want to inflate the number of deaths and make himself look worse, okay? So I'm skeptical of these kind of conspiracy theories unless you actually have evidence that people are going in there and tampering and misreporting the data.
Did conspiracy theorizing play a role 100 years ago in any significant way?
Not in 1918, no. The problem there is that, first of all, 1918 is not a presidential election year, okay? And the big news story of 1918 is World War I. It's not the influenza pandemic. All right. There's something else that people are concerned about. When there's 1 million Americans over in France and they are dying from German bullets, all right, this is the big headline. It's not the influenza epidemic. Now, if World War I isn't going on and you have a pandemic like this happening, all right, then you might say, okay, now people are going to say, all right, why are we having all these people suddenly die of influenza? What is going wrong here? And remember, too, you don't have a Cold War. You don't have a communist China. You don't have a communist Russia who is an enemy of the United States, where you could say, okay, we're getting this virus. Where's this virus coming from? Oh, it's coming from China. China is an enemy of the United States. Maybe the Chinese are doing something about this. That's not the situation in 1918. Okay. And when the Germans are doing something, they're using poison gas. They're not using bacteria as a weapon in the war. And nobody would think of using something like influenza because the mortality rate isn't high enough. Right? And if influenza normally doesn't kill people in their 20s and 30s, why would you use influenza? Okay? Why would there be this conspiracy? And people didn't really know. People are still arguing over, in fact, where the influenza virus of 1918 originated. Okay, we know there's a coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan, China. That's a fact. All right, that's where it started. All right. Whereas in 1918, there are people that argue that the influenza epidemic started in Kansas. There are people who argue that it started in Spain. There are people who argue it started in the trenches of World War I. There are people who argue that it started in the Middle East and spread to the West. Okay. So nobody really knows where this influenza epidemic actually originated from. And that tends to calm people down. If you don't know who to blame it on. Okay.
Does social distancing actually work, or is this a government health falsehood?
Social distancing works. Here's the chart. Okay. If you put social distancing measures in, you control the epidemic. If you don't put social distancing measures in, you don't control the epidemic. Secondly, why would the government want to sabotage itself? This is an election year, okay? And so why would all these government officials who are appointed by Donald Trump, many of them are rock-ribbed Republicans, why would they go along with a conspiracy which is going to hurt the economy and hurt Trump's chances for re-election if they are Trump supporters? That part does not make sense to me. Right? When you look at the influenza epidemic of 1918, you start to impose these measures and it's going to negatively impact the economy and there's going to be pressure. Okay. When you look at the coronavirus, there's going to be restrictions put in place and it's going to hurt the economy to a degree. On the other hand, you get this influenza epidemic under control and suddenly Dr. Starkloff is a hero. He saved thousands and thousands of lives. You get the coronavirus epidemic under control and suddenly you've saved thousands and thousands of lives. And Donald Trump can go on TV and say, vote for me. I saved your grandmother's and your grandfather's life. Okay. It doesn't make sense to me that people would say, oh, well, we're putting this social distancing in to hurt Trump. Had the government responded more effectively and imposed some of these restrictions earlier and knocked this coronavirus out early, Trump would have won election in a walk. Okay? As it is, and he knows, here's the coronavirus. This is the biggest challenge of my presidency. And when you announce something as the biggest challenge of your presidency and it doesn't turn out well, you've got a problem. That doesn't mean that Trump's necessarily going to lose in November. We don't know. We don't know that yet. Okay, but it certainly hasn't helped. And you look at Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter made an issue out of the Iran hostage crisis. Carter says, "I'm shutting down my campaign. I'm going to bring the hostages home." And people rally around Carter, and Carter's popularity goes up. And then he doesn't bring the hostages home. And the hostages are still being held. The hostages are still being held. The hostages are still being held. So by the time November rolls around, people say, okay, Carter promised to bring the hostages home. He didn't do it. We're voting for Ronald Reagan. And Carter loses. That's the situation that Trump faces. Any other questions?
Yes. Why do you think the virus has been so pervasive and deadly in the United States compared to other countries?
Well, one of the difficulties in the United States is we, of course, have values like individualism and individual responsibility and freedom. And so when the government comes along and says, we need to do X, people say, well, do I really want to do this? The president gives an order. The governors say, oh, do I really want to pay attention to this guy? All right. We have a decentralized system in the United States, and we have a strong tradition of individual freedom. South Korea did really, really well with this pandemic. When the initial outbreak occurred in Wuhan, China, the Chinese said, okay, we've got 29 deaths in Wuhan, and therefore we are shutting down the province of Wuhan. South Korea looks at that and said, okay, there are 29 million people in Wuhan. You know, China's a big country, right? And they're shutting down the entire country, the entire province over 29 deaths. The Chinese are lying to us. This is a serious pandemic. They're lying just like they lied about SARS back in 2003. Remember SARS? Okay. You had an outbreak of SARS, and the Chinese lied about it, and Hong Kong and South Korea really suffered. We're not making that mistake again. We're going to shut things down, and we're going to tell our people, okay, we're going to clamp down. We're going to put these restrictions in place. And these people say, yes, sure, we're going to do what's good for our collective society. We believe our government. We trust our government. The authoritarians say, do this, and we are going to obey. Americans don't react like that. Americans don't do that. Americans have to be convinced. You have to explain to Americans, look, here's the situation. Here's why we're doing this. You got to lay it out, and you've got to make that case. And you're still not going to convince a large portion of the public. They're not going to trust the government, no matter what the government says, no matter who is the president. Right? So I think that's the biggest reason, because in our society, we are much more open, much more individualistic. We are much more resistant to any kind of social controls being placed on us. Remember what King George did, right? We're going to put this tax on tea. We're going to make you guys pay for the French and Indian War. And what do? We throw the tea in the harbor, right? So much for listening to authority, right? So that, I think, is the biggest reason. Some of these other countries are used to taking orders from their government. They don't have a tradition of democracy. They don't have a tradition of individual freedom, and we do. In a lot of ways, that's a good thing. You know, if you give me a choice between living in South Korea and living in the United States, out of 100 different problems, 99 times out of 100, I'm going to prefer the United States to South Korea. This might be the one time that I wouldn't.
Very interesting point. Steve, this has been a great hour of power in terms of information and analysis. I think that addresses the questions that have come in. We had a pretty lively chat box that you might want to check when we're done.
I certainly will.
Yeah.
Great. Well, one of the advantages I've had is because I studied this for a number of years, because I had originally written a paper on the St. Louis epidemic. Then when it came time to do my dissertation, I wrote 2 chapters on the influenza pandemic in Chicago in my dissertation. And going to conferences, then I've learned about what happened in Winnipeg, Canada, what happened in New York, what happened in San Francisco. And so I've been studying this thing off and on for about 20 years. And so that turns out to be a real advantage, because when somebody says, well, what about this city? Oh, well, look over here. What about this city? Oh, well, look over here. So because I didn't just study St. Louis, I've studied a number of cities in the 1918 pandemic, and that gives me an edge over some of the people who've looked at this topic.
Excellent. Thank you.
Great. You're quite
Thanks
welcome.
to everyone who attended. We had a pretty good attendance. It ranged from 25 to 35 people at any given time. Nice little turnout for an afternoon lecture.
And this is going to be posted as well. So if people want to view it on the website, it's still going to be available.
Yes, sir.
Great.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you.